Okay, this is going to be kind of fast and furious, so just bear with me. So this is the funny, sorry. This is that fast and furious. This is the little John Stevens shop in Newport, Rhode Island. It's a bizarre little stone carving shop founded in 1705. If you come into Newport, you drive by, you wouldn't even give it a second look. And then what we basically do is we take a broad edge brush with paint. We paint letters on paper and transfer them onto stone, and we take a mountain chisel and carve those letters into stone. The commissions could be very simple, like a single character on a single piece of stone. This is for a architectural firm in Philadelphia, or thousands and thousands of characters like the National Martin Luther King Memorial. Before I get into all of what I'm doing right now, I'm going to take you all the way back to the colonial era and run you through the whole process of how I got to where I am now. So when you go back to the old colony, this is the old burying ground in Newport, Rhode Island, most of these old colonial stones came out of my shop. So the business has been chugging away all that time. So you go up there, you can look at all these old Stephen stones that came out of my shop. Now the thing is that most people, when they think of old colonial stones, they think of them as sort of cookie cutter pieces that are not particularly interesting and oftentimes sort of naively cut. But in fact, they were really, really beautiful, cohesive pieces of design. And the colonial guys, particularly the Stevens, a lot of these guys didn't have anything to look at reference-wise. There were no libraries, there were no existing cemeteries to look at. So a lot of what they were doing was informed by the actual use of the mallet and chisel. So both the letter form and the ornamental work were developed together, and they made this really, really beautifully cohesive design. Here's a really, really beautiful piece. And I'm going to zoom in on the lettering here. Because although there were some typographic references they could look at, really it was the mallet and the chisel that was driving this. So you look at that ampersand up there. This guy. It's totally wacky. And then you look at the A's, look at in Barbas and in William, there's these beautiful, beautiful forms that are really, really vernacular letters, and it was really all about the guys using the tools to understand these forms. What happened was at the end of the 18th century, typographic standards really came to the colonies and young America. So you had folks like John Baskerville, who was a type designer, and William Caslin. These typefaces came over and everybody said, hey, this is the new stuff. We want this on our gravestones. And it really, really changed the monument trade. So all of a sudden, stones started looking like broadsides and colophons and sort of like printed material. So the ornamental work, which you see up here in the tympanum and on the sides, started to have very, very little to do with the calligraphy, the lettering itself. And this interest in the typographic sort of got caricature-ish. It was more and more all about this sort of modern letter form. And modernity in general was chugging forward at this insane rate, and everybody just wanted the new, the mechanical looking. Even typefaces were being produced by machine. These punches that were used for type were produced by machine rather than hand-engraved punches. This is, this modern style is, of course, most obvious in the Bauhaus. And this is a typeface designed by Paul Renner called Futura, which has everything to do with modernity. There's absolutely no evidence whatsoever of the human hand in this. It's all about the machine. So this I just put in because this is a really, really great example of how the mechanical modern form has nothing to do with the hand. So what happened is that in the monument trade, ornamental work and lettering completely split off. And the ornamental work got very, very naturalistic, and the lettering became more and more and more mechanical. And the irony here is that guys were actually hand carving these letters to look machine-made, which is crazy. And then along came the process of sandblasting, which actually was a mechanical way of incising stone. So you'd put a piece of rubber on a piece of stone, you'd cut out the outline of the letter, remove the rubber, blast sand at the stone, and etch the inscription into the stone. Remove the rubber, hey, there's your inscription. Very, very quick. But here's a V-cut letter on the left and a sandblasted letter on the right, which is pretty early. I mean, obviously I'm biased. But a lot of what you're getting here too is that the linear quality that describes the sandblasted letter has much more to do with a typographic standard than the sculptural quality of the V-cut letter. So in the 20s, the early 20s, this was sort of the state of monument design. This is where we were in terms of monumental work and even architectural inscriptions. So my grandfather, the dapper young fellow that he is, decided, he came from an art background. He was at the Art Students League in New York City. He was a painter and a printmaker. He was really, really a gifted guy. He had great design sense. He designed the RISD seal much later, but I had to put it in, give my RISD people props. When he bought the John Stevens shop in 1927, all of this obsession with the modern was going on, and he said, screw that, I'm not gonna do that. I'm gonna grab the old tools, I'm going to make stones that are following the principles of the old work, but they're gonna be contemporary stones. So here is a stone that he did where a client said, okay, I want a colonial type of stone. And he said, okay, I'm gonna make the shape of a colonial stone. I'm gonna use some of the same basic forms, but this is really coming out of the arts and crafts movement with this sculptural low-level bas-relief. And then the lettering is all centered. It's not the way the colonial guys would lay it out. So it's making a nod to it, but it's very, very much its own thing. Here's a stone that he did as a replacement for an old colonial stone. And rather than making a sort of a mock version of the original stone, he said, no, let's just make a brand new stone. And so it doesn't adhere to any of those colonial outlines. He was a pretty academic dude, and so he started going back to the origins of letter forming, which took him all the way back to Rome 2,000 years ago, and what the Romans were doing with the brush. And he understood, as well as a bunch of colleagues of his, there was a sign painter, a guy named Edward Kadish, who wrote a book called The Origin of the Serif, who was really, really into the fact that the Romans had used a brush to develop these letters. So my grandfather grabbed a hold of that tool and said, okay, this is the way I gotta make these letters. This is an inscription that's on the Appian Way that is perhaps one of the most beautiful things ever made. It's to the children of Pompey Sextus Justus, and it is just a stunningly, stunningly beautiful piece of inscriptional work. I just had to throw that in there. But he also looked at Carolingian minuscule of the 9th century, which was the origin of lowercase lettering. He looked at chancery italic from the 16th century, which is the origin of italic lettering. And here's an alphabet stone that's representative of him rolling all of these influences together into what he turned into what he saw as contemporary lettering. It's just his take on all of those things. He made them very, very much his own. So here's a gravestone that he did after he had established all of this lettering style. And it kind of looks a little Roman, but it's in this black slate. It certainly doesn't look like a colonial stone. Here's a really, really beautiful tablet that he did for the Met in New York. Same type of aesthetic, just really, really original work. Beautiful, beautiful stuff. He died in 1956, and my dad took over the business in '63, and he, like my grandfather, was paying attention to what was going on at the time, being sensitive to it, but trying to find his own way within that context. So he was paying a lot of attention to some of very, very interesting typographers who had connections to calligraphy and studied historic forms. So William Addison Dwiggins was one of them. A guy named Rudolf Koch was another, and the late, great Hermann Zapf was another guy who made really, really beautiful typefaces. And my dad decided to turn, forget about that, John. He decided to turn his lettering into much more of a sort of typographically influenced form, but it was all done by hand. So when you look at his alphabet, it has a slightly more refined look than my grandfather's. But it was very, very much of the same basic historic fabric. This is a piece of italic lettering that my dad brushed and carved and gilded, and it's so goddamn beautiful. I just can't even get over it. I will never be this good. I will never be this good. Along came the computer in the 80s, and everybody all of my colleagues looked at my dad and said, "You're fucked. This is it, you're toast. This thing is gonna bury you." And my dad said, no. This is a great tool. It all depends on who's punching the buttons, right? So the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial in Washington, D.C. was happening, and my dad said, okay, I'm gonna use this tool to design a site-specific typeface for the memorial, and I'm gonna use it in concert with large title inscriptions that I'm gonna paint by hand and carve by hand. So here's the typeface that he designed. And then here's one of the title inscriptions. This is the central title inscription at the FDR Memorial. So when you're going in, you see this giant inscription, which was all painted by hand and carved by hand. But then there are these great bigger bodies of lettering that are the typeface, and they're sandblasted. But they work in concert with the hand-carved titles really, really well. So here's me as a punk kid in the backyard of the John Stevens shop, sucking it all in by osmosis, right? Just sucking it. You know, this is a sample for the John F. Kennedy Memorial. Ask not what your country will do for you. So I'm just taking it in. So I started working in the shop in 1979 and didn't really know exactly where I fit in. So I was doing a lot of work that was a lot like my grandfather's, very stylistic, ornamental work, but then a lot of stuff that's like my dad's, much more of a sort of typographic flavor on some of the refinement of the inscriptional work and the bas-relief work. But I, like my dad, got involved in the large architectural inscriptions. So this is the National World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C. This guy on the left here is Barry Owenby, my boss, and I'm asking if I can put this compressor over here, and he's saying, "I don't think so, bud." So what I did is I painted lettering many of the large quotes that I had to deal with on the MLK, on the World War II Memorial, and I made copious notes about how then I was going to adapt those when I scanned the letters into the computer and made my typeface. So here's the typeface I wound up with. And the thing about these typefaces that we design is that they're not made for graphic use. They are not made for black on white page. So when you look at them, you think, man, that's a clunky, heavy set thing. Because when you carve it into stone, you lose about 15% of the visual impact once it's carved in stone. So you have to make these decisions well in advance while you're designing the typeface. Here is the Roosevelt Memorial on Roosevelt Island, Louis Kahn's Four Freedoms Park. Polished modern, really, really beautiful, cohesive piece of design. And at the end of the memorial, there's this contemplative granite room. And there's the central inscription goes on that block there at the end. So I designed a sort of postmodern character for this job because it really, really had to be something that Louis Kahn would like. And here's the design for that inscription, which we then carved into the wall. And it turned out really, really nicely. So I continue to do work that's sort of all over the place with this. Going between modern stuff, historic stuff, a lot, very, very influenced by my dad's work, influenced by my grandfather's work. But the machine is changing things radically. And people use the computer now as a visual filter to assess the physical world. And I find more and more designers and architects coming into my shop and saying, you know, CNC machinery can do your job. You know, I don't see the merits in what you're doing. And I'm really, really concerned about this because it's leading to this aesthetic. So my question to you guys when we get to Q&A is, what do I do? Thank you.